So a running joke became that, well, I grew up learning about, the early church from Acts of the Apostles, and then I knew there was something about a guy named Martin Luther, and then there was Billy Graham, and that was kind of my sense of church history. I grew up in a small fundamentalist home and small church in western Montana in the 70s. I graduated high school in the 80s. And my parents were kind of raised, my mom was kind of a nominal Lutheran. My father was raised nothing. They were both originally from South Dakota. And then about 2 years before I was born, about 2 years after my parents got married, they had born-again experiences and were part of a Church of God for a while. And then when I was about 4 years old, we were then attending, and I just remember some of this, of course I was really young, we're attending a Christian Missionary Alliance group. And there was this dispute then that came up between some of the men, including my father, and the pastor about eternal security. If you're saved, once saved, or can you lose your salvation? That was the dispute. And my father, along with 3 other men, said, no, you can't lose your salvation. And the pastor disagreed. It's interesting because this pastor was actually the mentor of one of these other men, but they disagreed on this. And so my father and these 3 other men split off when I was about 4 or 5 years old and founded a little Bible chapel in western Montana. And so I do recall us breaking ground for that, and we have photos of that, and then building the chapel building. And so over the years, that's what I was raised in, and we had 4 elders. We didn't really have a pastor per se, and we were, I think, fairly historically, a fundamentalist group with some evangelical, aspects, leanings. Mindful those terms are kind of, get murky or hazy around the edges. But we were, very much about once saved, always saved, Scripture alone. We were anti-Catholic, but I would have to say that, on a regular basis, it wasn't like every Sunday was some kind of sermon about the evils of Romanism. That was something actually I didn't really hear a lot about from the pulpit. Actually, I only recall maybe a handful of those things. It was more actually in the literature I grew up with. I mean, I grew up reading Jack Chick comics and some other books about how Catholicism is wrong or pagan or even evil, not Christian, all that kind of stuff. So that was something I kind of was just immersed in, although it wasn't central to who we were. But what was interesting, I think, in looking back for me, was that 2 of the families that I became very close to growing up, the first one when I was probably just 6 or 7 years old, and then the other one in my junior high and high school years, were both Catholic families. And I would say, in fairness to them, who are wonderful, wonderful people, is that both of them were kind of nominally Catholic in certain ways. And yet we ended up having conversations about this topic. And so that was kind of interesting. It planted some seeds in my head. I would observe the fact that they were nominal, a term that I didn't even really know back then, but they didn't seem that serious about living Christian lives, even though they were good people. And I was very close to them. They had children who I was friends with. And then it was really after I graduated from high school and my first 3 years of college, I went to art school. I then went to a Nazarene school for a year to study art, had a couple of interesting religious theology courses. And after those first 2 years, I realized that I had a lot of things to kind of address in my life. I'd gone through a couple of bad relationships, and I just knew that spiritually I was kind of wandering a bit. I also was starting to read, C.S. Lewis, some more substantial things. I'd always been reading a lot of scripture, thankfully, and that's one of the great gifts that my background, my parents gave to me, was a love for the Bible. And so I ended up going to Bible college up in Canada, Briarcrest Bible College, for 2 years. I actually originally went up there just for 1 year, just to take kind of a year off, because my real goal was to pursue the arts, graphic design, but really ultimately fine art. That was kind of my interest. But then I went to Bible college, and I enjoyed it so much that I actually decided just to pursue a 2-year degree, an associate's degree in biblical studies is what it was. And I took New Testament Greek and had a bunch of really fantastic courses in Scripture, had some really exceptional teachers. I was very fortunate, made a lot of good friends that I'm still in touch with today. And that was really a turning point, because there I got some answers to some things, but I think and I went through some things in terms of my spiritual life that were really good. I came to grips with some things I had to address in my life. But what's really great is I came out of there with a lot of great questions. And one of the key things too in those 2 years, being around some really great professors and students who were very smart, was I realized, you don't really know as much as you think you do, Karl, about the Bible, about what it means to be Christian. I realized I really didn't know a lot. I was also exposed to a couple of courses on literature, to the writings of people like Flannery O'Connor, Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet, Charles Williams, who was not Catholic but Anglo-Catholic, who C.S. Lewis greatly admired. Williams was rather bizarre, but he was also quite brilliant. More C.S. Lewis, more T.S. Eliot, who I'd discovered when I was actually in junior high, and I always had liked his poetry. So these things started to build, and then I actually had some courses that touched on some aspects of church history. So very interesting. For example, I had a course early on Christian spirituality at Bible college as an evangelical, and we had to read selected excerpts from Augustine's Confessions. Now, one reason they were selected is because we had other stuff to read, I think also another reason is because it kind of cut out the more obviously Catholic aspects, right? You don't have the part in there where he talks about his ecstatic visions that he shares with his mother Monica and so forth. But reading that was really like the first early church thing I ever read, outside of Scripture, of course. And it was like really fascinating to me. So these seeds were being planted going through these 2 years of Bible college, really pivotal, I think, in hindsight. I was about 21 years old. I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I was going to pursue some kind of career in graphic design or something. Eventually got a job working in retail advertising for a large department store chain downtown Portland. And of course, that's really there's a lot of fascinating aspects to that culturally and also kind of spiritually. But one thing that was happening is I was spending a lot of time buying a lot of books, and eventually began reading a lot of early church fathers. And then the Catechism of the Catholic Church came out in English, and that was really pivotal, discovering that, we as former Protestants, when you find the Catechism, there's kind of a sense of finally one place, and of course we don't look at it like this is all there is to the Catholic faith, but it is one place where you can go and have so many different things addressed in a really cohesive, big picture way, but with a lot of detail. And so many of the footnotes and the quotes and things from the Catechism took me to other books, other writers. Was reading everything from Newman to Aquinas to John Paul II. John Paul II had a huge effect on me, and not really just because he was Pope, but because I began to read him, I just thought that his insights into the human person, his theological anthropology were just incredible. Much more depth than anything I'd really heard or experienced before. And then I was reading a lot of interesting stuff by people like Russell Kirk, who of course is a famous kind of cultural critic, political writer, who I would say has really a strong Augustinian aspect to his work. He had a big effect on me. G.K. Chesterton had a huge impact on me, especially orthodoxy, but then later Everlasting Man, his study of the Incarnation. And so just all these things. And then church history was just huge. As so many people who were raised Protestant and become Catholic will say, Newman is right, as he says at the beginning of his book on development of doctrine, that to be deep in history is cease to be Protestant. That became true for me, because I just realized that the way that I'd been raised as a fundamentalist was very American, very Protestant, of course, even though growing up, I didn't think of myself as a Protestant. I thought myself as a born-again Christian. And it was really true that there was this whole 1900 years or more of history that I was kind of oblivious to. And so my running joke became that, well, I grew up learning about, the early church from Acts of the Apostles, and then I knew there was something about a guy named Martin Luther, and then there was Billy Graham, and that was kind of my sense of church history. So I touched on a little bit more of that in Bible college, but then on my own afterwards, I began to read a lot more, and that's just a huge aspect of it, is seeing that the way that I've been raised, actually, the little non-denominational denomination that I've been raised in actually was just an offshoot of what was called the Plymouth Brethren movement, which itself had been formed in the 1820s and 1830s as an offshoot of Wesleyanism, which itself had broken off from the Anglican Communion, which of course had broken away in the 1530s, Henry VIII, from the Catholic Church. So as you go back and trace this back, it's like, wait a second, we're just kind of an offshoot of an offshoot of a branch of an offshoot, and getting the bigger picture and realizing that the things that I've been taught to believe about certain things, especially the end times eschatology, were not what Christians historically had believed. Quite the contrary, because I was raised to believe in the whole rapture movement. I read Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye long before the Left Behind books, et cetera, et cetera. So that, all these things in the history, and then I think really at the heart of it was recognizing at some point that what the Catholic Church teaches and what the Orthodox churches teach about the Eucharist is true, that it really is the true body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. This is what the early Christians believed. This is what you find in Scripture. This is the way it's been in the East and West for 2,000 years. That was huge. That was at the core of it, was recognizing that. And then so much more just formed, fleshed out around that reality. So Heather and I were married in 1994, and it was really around that time that we together experienced a shift. We were married in an evangelical church, but within the year after that, we were already kind of in a state of realizing that we kind of were going to be saying goodbye to our Protestant evangelical background. A real key insight for me that really had an impact on me was in Bible college. It was really funny. It was actually a professor I didn't have a class with. In hindsight, I wish I had a course with this particular professor anyway, but he, in a conversation in the hallway with some of the students, he mentioned this term, chronological snobbery. And then he talked about how C.S. Lewis used this term, and I eventually looked it up, and Lewis does talk about this. And it stuck with me because I realized that I had it. I had this attitude towards, tradition and history that was kind of dismissive in certain ways. Even though I liked reading history, it was like in terms of the Christian faith, well, obviously we know better. Here, 20th century American, I obviously know more than people back then. They were so this or that, right? And I began to realize that I had it completely upside down. That these are people, if you think back to Saint Irenaeus, all these different great saints, they were immersed in Scripture. You can't read Augustine, and just go away thinking, oh, this guy didn't know anything. I mean, he obviously just knew incredible amounts. I mean, essentially probably memorized just huge passages of Scripture. So that really struck me. And then when I moved to Portland and I was living for a short time with some relatives, my cousin and his wife, wonderful people, she was an Episcopalian, and we got into this little discussion, not really an argument, just talking, and she said, well, very innocently, she said, well, how do you know that your understanding the Bible is correct? She wasn't even trying to argue. She was actually puzzled, like, well, how do you know that you're, and I'm like, well, because I read the Bible, obviously. But I realized that she had hit on something in her innocent question, and that really planted another seed. And then when I began to read early church fathers, and you begin to read what they're saying about the early Gnostics, and I remember reading about the Docetists who didn't believe the Eucharist really was the body and blood of Christ. They just said it was. I thought, wait a second, what I was raised as a fundamentalist to believe was essentially the same thing. We would actually had a weekly communion service at this little Bible chapel I grew up in, which, interestingly enough, which is not usual for a lot of Protestant groups. But we emphasized it's just a reminder. That was the big thing. It was a reminder. And yet when you read John 6, where Christ says several times, eat my flesh, drink my blood, it doesn't seem to be an aspect of a reminder as much as a reality. This is it. So that, and then of course, as I began to read what the church fathers consistently said about the Eucharist, that was a linchpin. That really was key. And then this became this process where I was like kind of desperate, like, well, we better look at the Lutheran Church, we better look at this. But that phase was very quick because I just realized that I was not going to escape the reality that the Catholic Church was just there, you know. And I was very fortunate. Heather and I were living across the street for a short time from St. Paul's Parish in Eugene, Oregon, and finally got up the courage to go over and meet the priest, Father Timokaitis, who was fantastic. And I remember being in his office, and he had this nice little library, including a bunch of C.S. Lewis and a bunch of other authors I recognized, and he was wonderful. And basically, he just let me kind of rant and talk and share and whatever, emote. And he was wonderful. He's very pastoral. And he said, well, please come to, think about going through RCIA, come to Mass. He said, now, of course, you're not able to receive communion. You have to be Catholic. And he was very wonderful about that. I really respected that about him, especially as he went forward and stuff. And so then we went through the RCIA program there, and we had a really wonderful experience. That was really wonderful because I have too many friends and people I know who had really rocky experiences going through various RCIA programs or meeting a priest, and these stories are true, where the priest said, well, I don't think you need to become Catholic, these crazy things. We really had a wonderful experience, and it was certainly tough in the sense that we had friends and family members, especially on my side of the family, who were like, what are you doing? In fact, when my parents found out, they were very unhappy. But we worked through that. Lost a few friends, a few people that said, I basically don't want to talk to anymore. A handful, but for the most part, even my Bible college friends, we had these great conversations. Sometimes kind of a debate, but it was good, and I think overall really positive. And I wasn't in the ministry. I wasn't ever a Protestant pastor. I didn't have to worry about losing my job, so I was very, very fortunate in that regard. I was able kind of free to do my thing and study and become Catholic without worrying about those really practical things that a lot of people have to. And then the thing that was really, really providential finally was that we were in the RCIA program, and during that time, our sponsors, Deacon Jack Luz and his wife Lorraine, Deacon Jack was finishing up his master's in theological studies through the University of Dallas through an extension program in Portland, Oregon. And he said, hey, you should consider doing this program. It was a weekend program, 3-year thing. And I did that, and that was fantastic. First of all, the program itself was fantastic, but then I also got to meet a bunch of people, including Mark Brumley, who eventually became my boss at Ignatius Press, and it was through him that I wrote my first book, Will Catholics Be Left Behind? So I really deeply blessed and lucky, but obviously not lucky. It was providential. These connections happened. That program was great because it filled in various holes in my formation. I mean, obviously, I didn't on my own study and learn and read everything about the Catholic Church. There were a lot of things I had to learn. You spend your whole life learning about the Catholic faith and realize there's still so much more. So 1997 is when I entered the church. It's gone by quickly, but it's been a really wonderful journey. So I mentioned the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which, if I remember correctly, it came out in 1994. I know that for sure, but I think it was translated into English like early 1995. And I went to Powell's bookstore, downtown Portland, very famous bookstore, one of the largest in the world. And I was looking for a copy of that. I grabbed a copy of it. It just come out in English. And I was sitting there looking at some other books, and there was a book called Catholicism and Fundamentalism. And I was still working through some of the questions from my fundamentalist past. And there was another young guy there, and he was looking at some books, and he saw me pick it up. And for some reason, I put it back, Catholicism and Fundamentalism by Karl Keating, who I later got to know. And he said, I would really recommend that book. And I said, okay. I said, why do you like it? He said, well, he really answers, these questions and stuff really well. And he said, I'm a former, he said that he was a former evangelical who recently become Catholic, and that he was there getting literature on the history of the Trappists. He was thinking about becoming a Trappist monk. So we had a nice little talk, and I picked up that book. And I later told Karl Keating, the author of that book, and of course the founder of Catholic Answers, that it was great because that book saved me a lot of time. I mean, he really, even though he himself was a raised Catholic, he really gets fundamentalism, and he does such a great job in that book. And so that really helped me work through some key things. And that was great. And then the Catechism was so incredibly helpful. And I personally know 6 or 7 people, former Protestants, who become Catholic in large part because they read or had access to the Catechism. I know some of them who just read it cover to cover. And of course, the Catechism was not written or produced as an evangelical tool, so to speak. But I think, again, it's the fact that it's so cohesive, it brings such a coherence to everything, and then it references so many things. It really is helpful. You know, on our journey, you know, we had some bumps along the way. Again, we were really fortunate. We didn't have a lot of issues, but I did have some interesting conversations with family members or friends who were opposed to us becoming Catholic. And I asked one family member once, I said, so what are your 3 top reasons for being opposed to the Catholic Church, or what does the Catholic Church get wrong? And he said, well, you worship the Pope, you worship Mary, and you think the Pope can't sin. And I said, well, great news. Don't believe any of those things. You know, you can now, consider becoming Catholic. It's not an issue. And of course, he didn't think that was very funny. But one of the big moments for me in terms of just kind of knowing that I had finally fully gone over to the dark side, so to speak, was that my kind of a mentor from my time in Portland, a fundamentalist pastor by the name of Richard, who just died a couple years ago. He came to see me. He was very concerned. And we had a 6-hour conversation in my living room and it was just, one thing after another, right? And I remember how he went after the belief in the Eucharist. He was really big on the issue of Jesus. Of course, Jesus had, brothers and sisters. It's right there in the Scripture. So we were talking about these things, and so he brought up the issue of Jesus' apparent brothers and sisters, and we went into the Greek a little bit, and I mentioned the word adelphos and all that, and how it it could refer to cousins, et cetera, and there was more to it, and then what I distinctly remember is he said, well, that's the problem with you Catholics. You interpret everything in the Bible metaphorically. Everything is metaphorical, and I said, it's interesting you say that. I said, because what I'm saying here is not metaphorical. I'm not saying the word is metaphorical. I'm saying it actually can refer to a wider variety of relatives than just brother and sister. That's the nature of the Greek word. But since you brought up the issue of metaphor, why don't we go to John chapter 6, where Jesus says several times, 5 times, if I remember correctly, eat my flesh and drink my blood. And he was incensed. He was angry. I said, come on, seriously. I said, this is what the church has always taught. It's always been there in the East and the West, And that did not end well. I mean, in fact, he said at the end, after he left after 6 hours, he said, you are on your way to hell. He flatly said that. And for me, that was kind of a final severing, with that fundamentalist kind of past, where I made peace with the fact that, now obviously I still have family members who are fundamentalists and so forth. But that was, in a way, it was kind of cathartic and good. I felt bad that he ended it that way, but, and we never did speak again after that, and he passed away. But I remained close friends with his son, who was a pastor. In fact, he was my pastor when I was in my late teens. And he and I have had many great conversations about the Catholic faith. He's reading Catholic authors. I don't know where that's going to go with him. But it's just, he himself has also, in a way, kind of jettisoned that fundamentalist past and has really embraced a much, I think, bigger and deeper view of the Christian heritage with a deeper understanding of the Catholic aspect. So, it's interesting how these things go over time. So around the time that Heather and I started going through the RCIA program in 1996, 1995 is when I think I first met Father Timokaitis, and then we started up the RCIA program shortly thereafter. And that was when the whole Left Behind series, that phenomenon, was starting to blow up, right? We had Tim LaHaye with Jerry B. Jenkins, who co-authored this hugely successful series of books. Well, this came out of this theological system called premillennial dispensationalism, at the heart of which is this belief in a rapture, an event where Christians are taken out, true Christians are taken off the earth prior to 7 years of intense tribulation in which the majority, like 3/5 or whatever of the earth's population is going to suffer and die, et cetera, et cetera. And then you'll have the second coming of Christ, and then 1,000-year earthly reign. And then, there's this really elaborate theological system. Well, I was born and raised in this system. My parents were very staunch premillennial dispensationalists. And I grew up, as I mentioned before, I grew up reading Tim LaHaye's books long before the Left Behind books. I mean, back in the 70s, he had actually put out some books on biblical prophecy. He wrote some other books, too, on various other topics. And then Hal Lindsey's mega-selling books, Late Great Planet Earth, et cetera, et cetera. So I grew up immersed in that. And what I began to see as we were going through RCIA is people, Catholics, in the RCIA, people who are becoming Catholic, or even people I met who were Catholic, were like, "Oh, these books are great. I love these books." And I'm like, wait a second. I said, no. I said, this is really absolutely contrary to a Catholic understanding of the end times, of the church, ecclesiology, of Christology, everything. And like, oh, no, it's just fun. It's biblical. And so I ended up writing some articles about it. Some of my first articles as a Catholic author were about this topic. And then in my master's program, I had Father Mitch Pacwa as a professor. It was fantastic. And he's like, Karl, you should write a book on this topic. And Will Catholics Be Left Behind came out in 2003. I think working through that whole system of belief, dispensationalism, was really great for me because there's so many aspects of it in contrast to the Catholic faith. People think of it in terms of the end times, but like I like to say when I give talks on it, it begins with a flawed Christology. It's a theology that says, well, Christ came, but he's essentially rejected by all the Jews. So he had to form a plan B, which was the church. And his initial plan was that he was going to give this kingdom, this restored Davidic kingdom, to the Jews, but they all rejected it. And so he had to start plan B, which was kind of the backup plan. And then that leads to a really warped ecclesiology view of the church, where it's like a secondary plan. Whereas the Catechism, for example, has this great quote from the early church writing where it says the world was created for the sake of the church, which is really a mind-blowing quote, right? Like, what does that mean? Well, there's a lot there. But there's really this high ecclesiologist, high view of church, not because it's a man-made institution, but precisely because it was created by the man, the God-man, Jesus Christ. That then leads to really distorted, over-the-top, increasingly crazy end times belief, eschatology. So bad Christology, bad ecclesiology, you end up with bad eschatology, right? And so it's great. I was able to work through all these things, deepen my faith in many ways in working through those. And what I discovered is that there were a lot of Catholics who didn't understand that the novels were like the gateway drug, if you will, to this whole belief system. It's an entire encompassing worldview of how to interpret Scripture, how to understand the faith, everything. And it really is contrary to a healthy Catholic perspective. What I found, ironically, is that some of the best critiques of this entire system were not written by Catholics, but by mostly Calvinists, people from the Reformed Protestant tradition. And I quote them liberally in my book because they're good. They really get it. And they really point out a lot of the hermeneutical and ecclesial errors that you find in the Left Behind books and then the related literature. And then I ended up having a written debate with Tim LaHaye. It actually got that arranged. And what came through with that was just how he was so historically illiterate. So for example, he, in one of his nonfiction books that's tied into the Left Behind series, he claims that 60 million people were killed by the Catholic Church during the Spanish Inquisition. And I kind of joked, if I remember correctly, I joked in there about, well, this is better than Jimmy Stewart, who said 120 million. But I said, you're still off, because I said historians now acknowledge that probably during the 300 years or so of the Spanish Inquisition, there are probably somewhere around 3,000 to 8,000 people who were tried and executed. And there's a lot of complexities to that too, which is not to excuse wrong things that were done, but it's 5,000 people compared to 60 million, substantial, right? And his response, and I gave quotes from 3 different historians. And to me, this sums up the fundamentalist attitude towards these things. I gave 3 quotes that backed up what I was saying about the Spanish Inquisition. And he wrote back to me and said, well, I see that you've just fully embraced a Catholic view of history, very dismissive. And my response to him was, well, none of these three authors are Catholic. These are books published by like Yale University. These are modern historians, people still alive. I think in one case, one of the authors is atheist. And I don't think the other two were Catholic at all. I'm pretty sure they weren't. But that was not the issue. They were looking at the data. That to me just summed up, so much of this fundamentalist approach to history. The real kicker that a lot of people don't know about Tim LaHaye, who died a few years ago, is that he was born and baptized Catholic. His parents were Catholic. He was baptized Catholic, and then when he was about the age of 2, he was very young, his dad took up with this fundamentalist, anti-Catholic, I think it was Baptist group, and left the Catholic Church. And then Tim LaHaye himself was raised with this real animosity, which burned throughout his whole life, And to me, it's deeply sad, that attitude. And he embraced a system that was established or built in the 1820s, 1830s. He ignored, like I had done so often, centuries and centuries of the tradition of church history. So it's just interesting how things go in different direction. And I think, again, this willingness to look at history. And when you look at history, by the way, you acknowledge that a lot of Catholics did a lot of really bad things. There have been bad popes. There have been a lot of stupid things done in the name of the Catholic faith. But at the end of the day, the church was established by Jesus Christ. It's not built on the bravado of bad Catholics. It's built on the blood of the martyrs, as Tertullian said. And I think that's really the thing to keep in mind when you look at a lot of these difficulties in the church today and look at some of the historical difficulties as well.